the good, upstanding moral qualities that we should all aspire to as examples, right? The Buddha, whatever it might be. Those people wouldn't make good leaders, because what you need to be a good leader often requires the kind of choices that a true philosophical Diogenes moral man wouldn't make.
Hey guys, it's Sai. If you're super curious but don't always have the time to watch your favourite podcasts, you've found the right place. Here's your summary of Lex Fridman 136, with Dan Carlin, the host of Hardcore History, in less time than it takes to tell a story. Through Hardcore History, Dan frames the sleep-inducing history textbooks we read in high school as a journey through lives we wish we could live, and stories we wish we could tell. He takes the seemingly linear events of history and turns them into meticulously woven stories used to attract even the most uninterested. He does complete multi-part retellings of major events like World War II, and even dives into the brutal use of humans as commodities through time, what pain was like in the past, and how the pain of others was the primary form of entertainment for most of antiquity. To start things off, Dan gives us some backstory on how his journey with hardcore history started. Dan began by running a political radio show on KFI AM 640 out of Los Angeles called 60 Second History, starting in the late 90s. His show ran until around 2004, when he and a few other people he worked with realised there was something more to this whole internet content thing.
My history of how I got involved in podcasting is interesting. I was in radio, and then I started a company back in the era where the .com boom was happening and everybody was being bought up, and it just seemed like a great idea. We were pitching to investors with something called amateur content. So this is before YouTube, before podcasting, before all this stuff. And my job was to be the evangelist. Mm-hmm. And I would go to these people and talk and sing the praises of all the ways that amateur content was going to be great. And I never got a bite. And they all told me the same thing. This isn't going to take off because anybody who's good is already going to be making money at this. And I kept saying, forget that. We're talking about scale here. If you have millions of pieces of content being made every week, a small percentage is going to be good no matter what, right? 16-year-olds will know what other 16-year-olds like. And I kept pushing this and nobody bit. But the podcast grew out of that because if you're talking about amateur content in 1999, you're ahead of the game in terms of not seeing where it's going to go financially, but seeing where it's going to go technologically. And so when we started the podcast in 2005, and it was the political one, not Hardcore History, which was an outgrowth of the old radio show, we didn't have any financial ideas. We were simply trying to get our handle on the technology and how you distribute it to people and all that. And it was years later that we tried to figure out, okay, how can we get enough money to just support us while we're doing this? And the cheap and the easy way was just to ask listeners to donate, like a PBS kind of model. And that was the original model.
Dan's radio show turned podcast is very different from most of the podcasts out there. He has a unique style of retelling history in the form of story, something most writings of history fail to do effectively. Most of what is read and taught as history is a boring retelling of facts, but Dan keeps the informative essence of a textbook while intertwining it with a rich and captivating narrative. His episodes are openly filled with ambiguity in his effort to show just how nuanced history really is. Funnily enough, he doesn't even view himself as a historian.
As I often say, I'm not a historian, which is why what I try to bring to the Hardcore History podcasts are these sub-themes. So each show has and they're not, I try to kind of soft pedal them, so they're not always like really right in front of your face.
He's given an avenue for the textbook uninclined to venture into the rich stories of the past. Stories that have so much depth and wisdom, but are often locked behind language barriers and tedium. I know personally, he has invigorated a new passion for what those that came before said, and how I can apply what they knew then to my life now. I'm sure you'll feel the same. But why does history matter? Does it even matter? I'm sure we've all heard the saying, history is doomed to repeat itself. But is that the case? Are we, and those that come after us, really doomed to repeat the same mistakes on a never-ending loop until the heat death of the universe? And even then, what comes after that? And why does that matter? You, I, and all the people we know will be long gone by then. Lex asked Dan through the same vein.
Do you think there's in that common humanity throughout history of the guinea pig, is there a why underneath it all? Or is it somehow like, it feels like it's an experiment of some sort?
Oh, now you're into Elon Musk and I talked about this, the simulation thing, right? Nick Bostrom's
Sure.
yeah, the idea that there's some kid and we're the equivalent of an alien's ant farm,
Yeah.
and we hope he doesn't throw a tarantula in just to see what happens. I think the whys elude us. And I think that what makes philosophy and religion and those sorts of things so interesting is that they grapple with the whys. But I'm not wise enough to propose a theory myself, but I'm interested enough to read all the other ones out there. So let's put it this way. I don't think there's any definitive why that's been agreed upon, but the various theories are fascinating.
Yeah. Whatever it is, whoever the kid is that created this thing, the ant farm is kind of interesting.
Well, so far, he's a little bit twisted and perverted and sadistic, maybe.
That's what makes it fun, I think. But then again, that's the Russian perspective.
I was just going to say, it is the Russian perspective.
Dan is a particularly interesting person to ask this kind of question because he has an ocean of perspectives to pull from when comparing the whys of the world. From why chocolate is delicious to why grass is green. Both questions seem obvious, but at bottom are much deeper than they initially seem. Even though these questions outwardly are very different, each involve us. Me and you and your friends. Humans at large. We're all human, and the ancients are too. Dan not only seconds this sentiment, but views it as one of his primary drivers for wondering of the whys.
Sometimes that I find interesting is certain consistencies that we have over time. History doesn't repeat, but it has a constant, and the constant is us. Now we change. I mentioned earlier the wickedly weird time we live in with what social media is doing to us as guinea pigs, and that's a new element. But we're still people who are motivated by love, hate, greed, envy, sex. All these things that would have connected us with the ancients, right? Mm-hmm. That's the part that always makes history sound like it rhymes, And when you put the constant, the human element, and you mix it with systems that are similar. So one of the reasons that the ancient Roman Republic is something that people point to all the time as something that seems like we're repeating history is because you have humans, just like you had then, and you have a system that resembles the one we have here. So you throw the constant in with a system that is somewhat similar, and you begin to see things that look like they rhyme a little. So for me, I'm always trying to figure out more about us. And when you show us in 500 years ago in Asia, and 800 years ago in Africa, and you look at all these different places that you put the guinea pig in, and you watch how the guinea pig responds to the different stimuli and challenges, I feel like it helps me flesh out a little bit more who we are in the long timeline, not who we are today specifically, but who we've always been. It's a personal quest. It's not meant to educate anybody else. It's something that fascinates me.
None of us can see it now. But the fathers of the future will inevitably look back on our time in history as one of the singularities. The internet is arguably the biggest Pandora's box ever opened, and there's no telling how it will affect us and our children. But also, the children of the generations long after we turn into cosmic dust, with the only golden thread keeping us held together being that of history, and how it was told, so that those same future bearers will read, listen, and interpret everything from podcasts to memes and make assumptions as to how we lived and thought. In the same way that Dan does for us, they might even be able to see your browser history. God, that's scary. Anyways, continuing along the golden thread of history, Lex and Dan confront the topic of World War II, specifically if Hitler was an inevitable happening of the times. Or was he a special kind of evil? A kind that only he could have done in that time, at that place, and with those experiences. Was the Holocaust because of Hitler, or was the Holocaust inevitable?
And I don't quite know what to think about Hitler without the Holocaust. And perhaps in his thinking, how essential the anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews was. Do you think World War II, as it turned out, and Hitler as he turned out, would be possible without anti-Semitism? Could we have avoided the Holocaust?
Not an integral part of fascism, because Mussolini really, I mean,
Right.
Mussolini did it to please Hitler, but it wasn't an integral part. What's interesting to me is that that's the big anomaly in the whole question, because anti-Semitism didn't need to be a part of this at all, right? Hitler had a conspiratorial view of the world. He was a believer that the Jews controlled things, right? The Jews were responsible for both Bolshevism on one side and capitalism on the other. They ruled the banks. I mean, the United States was a Jewified country, right? Bolshevism was a Jewified sort of a political. In other words, he saw Jews everywhere, and he had that line about if the Jews of Europe force another war to Germany, they'll pay the price or whatever. But then you have to believe that they're capable of that. The Holocaust is a weird sidebar to the whole thing. And here's what I've always found interesting. It's a sidebar that weakened Germany.
In a twisted and awfully fantastical story of the Jews in World War II, Jews were simultaneously the most victimized and accomplished group of people from the war. One of the most obvious examples of this was none other than Albert Einstein and the atom bomb.
Look at the First World War. Jews fought for Germany, right? Who was the most important Jewish figure that would have maybe been on the German side had the Germans had a non-anti-Semitic, well, listen, that whole part of Europe, yes, it was Einstein. But the whole, I should point out that to say Germany or Europe or Russia or any of those things were not anti-Semitic is to do injustice to history, right? Pogroms everywhere. I mean,
Yes.
that is it's standard operating procedure. What you see in the Hitlerian era is an absolute huge spike, right? Because the government has a conspiracy theory that the Jews have. It's funny because Hitler both thought of them as weak and super powerful at the same time. But Einstein, let's just play with Einstein. If there's no anti-Semitism in Germany, or none above the normal level, right? The baseline level, does Einstein leave along with all the other Jewish scientists? And I mean, and what does Germany have as increased technological and intellectual capacity if they stay? Right? It's something that actually weakened that state. It's a tragic flaw in the Hitlerian worldview. Somewhere along the line, and really not at the beginning, this guy became absolutely obsessed with this.
With a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and Jews. And he surrounded himself with people and theorists, I'm going to use that word really sort of loosely, who believed this too, that the Jews control the world, that he called it international Jewry was a huge part of the problem, and that because of that they deserved to be punished, they were an enemy within, all these kinds of things. It's a nutty conspiracy theory that the government of one of the most leading figure in culture and philosophy and all these kinds of things, and that they could be overtaken with this wildly, wickedly weird conspiracy theory, and that it would actually determine things. I mean, Hitler was taking vast amounts of German resources and using it to wipe out this race when he needed them for all kinds of other things, to fight a war of annihilation.
Not only did Hitler, in his relentless pursuit to cleanse the world of what he saw as a plague, curse his militaristic strategy to hell. +1 for the Jews, but he was so captured by the sick and twisted imaginations of a pure Germanic culture that he lost the war because of it, and caused the biggest manufactured stain on history since time began. And today we are still trying to mend the wounds he opened.
The world debates the military response 19 days since the worst terror attack in Israeli history.
Hitler truly is and was the embodiment of pure evil by the end of the war. Arguably the closest physical representation of the devil on earth and harbinger of hell man has seen. May history never repeat the untold atrocities he engineered. Will it always be this way? Will the world of nations and peoples inevitably fight to the death forever? Is the only answer to really kill those of the same blood? People who came into the world the same way we did and suffer likewise, all throughout the world. Does peace reign at the end of time, or does time require conflict to move? As Lex puts it,
where do you put violence? Is it core to being human, or is it just a little tool that we use every once in a while?
So I'm going to respond to your question with a question. What do you see the difference being between violence and force. Let me go farther. I'm not sure that violence is something that we have to put up with as human beings forever, that we must resign ourselves to violence forever. But I have a much harder time seeing us able to abolish force. There's going to be some ground where, if those two things are not the same, and I don't know, that maybe they are, where there's certainly some crossover. And I think force, think about it as a physical law. If you can't stop something from moving in a certain direction without pushing back in that same direction, I'm not sure that you can have a society or a civilization without the ability to use a counterforce when things are going wrong, whether it's on an individual level, right? A person attacks another person, so you step in to save that person, or on, even at the highest levels of politics or anything else, a counterforce to stop the inertia or the impetus of another movement. So I think that force is a simple, almost law of physics in human interaction, especially at the civilizational level. I think civilization requires a certain amount of, if not violence, then force.
Dan makes a good point. As it stands today, even the crowning civilization of mankind, the United States of America, required and requires a level of force most people, in retrospect, would wince at. The killing, pillaging and plundering of the British Army, indigenous peoples of the Americas, and ourselves in the Civil War are events you might look at and think, how were those good? How could they even be considered sort of good? Now, this is by no means a moral judgment on whether those were either moral or just acts of force, but it is undeniable fact that those events were paramount to the formation of what we regard as the free world. But it goes even further back than us.
And again, they've talked, it goes back into St. Augustine, all kinds of Christian beliefs about the proper use of force, and people have philosophically tried to decide between, can you have a sort of an ahimsa, Buddhist sort of, we will be nonviolent toward everything and exert no force, or there's a reason to have force in order to create the space for good. I think force is inevitable. Now, we can talk, and I've not come up to the conclusion myself, if there is a distinction to be made between force and violence. Is a non-violent force enough, or is violence when done for the cause of good a different thing than violence done either for the cause of evil, as you would say, or simply for random reasons? We humans lack control sometimes. We can be violent for no apparent reason or goal. You look at the criminal justice system alone and the way we interact with people who are acting out in ways that we as a society have decided is intolerable. Can you deal with that without force and at some level violence? I don't know. Can you maintain peacefulness without force? I don't know.
Just to be a little bit more specific about the idea of force, do you put force as general enough to include force in the space of ideas? So you mentioned Buddhism or religion or just Twitter.
I can think of no things farther apart than that.
Okay. Is the battles we do in the space of ideas, of the great debates throughout history, do you put force into that? Or do you, in this conversation, are we trying to right now keep it to just physical force? In saying that you have an intuition that force might be with us much longer than violence.
I think the two bleed together.
Interestingly, as Lex points out, it isn't obvious what defines force. Is force the pull towards ice cream when you're hungry? Well, yeah, that seems logical. You seem to be pulled to it. Maybe a little too much even. But what about pushing someone? That's even more obvious, isn't it? Okay, well, what about the interaction of the ethos of truth on humanity since antiquity? Not only was that a mouthful to say, it's also a brainful to think about. Simply, hasn't good always won? If you look at all of history, hasn't it gotten better for everyone? It probably seems that way, right? Just think about how many people died from the Black Plague 700 years ago. In around 50 years, 15% of the entire world just died, even in the most affluent areas of the world. But today it's not even a thought in most of our minds. We are able to eat Cheetos and listen to music at our whim. Personally, I'm glad to be born today. But what if truth isn't a pull? What if it just is? What if other things just are and force isn't needed? Regardless of whether force is or isn't needed, one thing stands true. The great leaders of history had substantial amounts of force over the people they governed. Their people trusted them and, in some sense, even allowed themselves to be pulled. This isn't to say that what makes a man great makes them good, but irrefutably these people of history had so much influence over the world we still talk about them today. So, what made them tick? How did they get so much power? Or better yet,
What do you think makes a great leader? Maybe if you have other examples throughout history. And great, again, let's use that term loosely.
Yeah, I was
Meaning
going to ask for a definition.
great uniter of whether it's evil or good, it doesn't matter.
It's an interesting question, and one I've thought a lot about because, well, let's take Alexander the Great as an example, because Alexander fascinated the world of his time, fascinated ever since. People have been fascinated with the guy. But Alexander was a hereditary monarch, right?
Yeah.
He was handed the kingdom.
Which is fascinating.
Right, but he did not need to rise from nothing to get that job. In fact, he reminds me of a lot of other leaders, Frederick the Great, for example, in Prussia. These are people who inherited the greatest army of their day. Alexander, unless he was an imbecile, was going to be great no matter what, because, I mean, if you inherit the Wehrmacht, you're going to be able to do something with it, right? Alexander's father may have been greater. Philip II was the guy who literally did create a strong kingdom from a disjointed group of people that were continually beset by their neighbors. He's the one that reformed that army, took things that he had learned from other Greek leaders like the Theban leader Epaminondas, and then laboriously over his lifetime stabilized the frontiers, built this system. He lost an eye doing it. His leg was made lame. I mean, this was a man who looked like he built the empire and led from the front ranks. And then, who may have been killed by his son, we don't know who assassinated Philip, but then handed the greatest army the world had ever seen to his son, who then did great things with it. You see this pattern many times. So in my mind, I'm not sure Alexander really can be that great when you compare him to people who arose from nothing. So the difference between what we would call in the United States the self-made man or the one who inherits a fortune.
does the man make the state, or was the state destined to succeed? Mirroring what we learned about Hitler earlier in the conversation, whether or not the chicken or the egg came first, the chicken is. And so is the egg. Plainly, it depends. But on what exactly?
And I'm always fascinated by that idea that, and I'm trying to remember who the quote was by, that great men, Lord Acton, so great men are often not good men. And that in order to be great, you would have to jettison many of the moral qualities that we normally would consider a Jesus or a Gandhi, or, the Martin, these qualities that one looks at as the good, upstanding moral qualities that we should all aspire to as examples, right? The Buddha, whatever it might be. Those people wouldn't make good leaders, because what you need to be a good leader often requires the kind of choices that a true philosophical Diogenes moral man wouldn't make.
Dan and Lex seem to think it might take a drop of poison for the state to flourish. But is that always the case? Was Abraham Lincoln not a generally good man? What about Gandhi or Jesus? Are they not great men who led revolutions still being carried out to this day? Does the poison have to seep through the veins of the leader, or can someone drink it for them? At least for Lincoln, Gandhi and Jesus, the poison never had a chance. But this isn't always the case. Far from it. From Hitler to Stalin, Mao, and even the Joker, bad people do bad things. From imagination to real life, evil still finds its path to mayhem. In the world we live in, this truth seems to be getting more real by the day. Again, we are living through a singularity, one of nuclear warfare, artificial intelligence, and bioweapons. These technologies are a very recent toy for humankind to try their hand at, with little to no room for failure. And humans aren't known to be perfect. Can it be stopped?
What governs my view of this thing is the ability for us to focus ourselves collectively, right? And that gives me the choice of looking at this and saying, what are the odds we will do X versus Y, right? So go look at the 62 Cuban Missile Crisis,
Yes.
where we looked at the potential of nuclear war and we stared right in the face of that. To me, I consider that to be, you want to talk about a hopeful moment? That's one of the rare times in our history where I think the odds were overwhelmingly that there would be a nuclear war. John F. Kennedy, by himself, probably made decisions that saved 100 million or more lives because everyone around him thought he should be taking the road that would have led to those deaths. And to push back against that is, when you look at it now, I mean, again, if you were a betting person, you would have bet against that. And that's rare, right? When we talk about how the world will end, the fact that one person actually had that in their hands meant that it wasn't a collective decision. That was something where the higher ethical ideas of a single human being could come into play and make the decisions that influence the events.
This notion that the individual is sane but the group is a madman has been casted throughout time with many different forms. Evolutionarily, this was paramount for succession. Tribes were the mob who went mad, tribes went to war. But peace eventually bestowed even the most brutal tribes. How? Single men and women made courageous decisions against all odds in hope of peace for the mutual good of the other and themselves. But what happens when the problem is so big that a single individual, at face value, can't stop it? What if they don't have the power, influence, or capability? What if it requires the collective all at once to come together and solve the problem? Can a tribe really temper all savagery at the drop of a hat to save the world?
So take what we're doing to the planet. And we talk about it always now in terms of climate change, which I think is far too narrow. I always get very frustrated when we talk about these arguments about, is it happening? Is it human? Just look at the trash. Forget climate for a second. We're destroying the planet because we're not taking care of it. And because what it would do to take care of it would require collective sacrifices that would require enough of us to say, okay. And we can't get enough of us to say, okay, because too many people have to be on board. It's not John F. Kennedy making one decision from one man. We have to have 85% of us or something around the world. Not just, you can't say we're going to stop doing damage to the world here in the United States if China does it, right? So the amount of people that have to get on board that train, you get pessimistic hoping for those kinds of shifts unless it's right, Krypton's about to explode. And so I think if you're talking about a gambling man's view of this, that's got to be the odds-on favorite because it requires such a unanimity. And the systems maybe aren't even in place, right? The fact that we would need intergovernmental bodies that are completely discredited now on board, and you would have to subvert the national interests of nation states. I mean, the amount of things that have to go right in a short period of time, where we don't have 600 years to figure this out, right? So to me, that looks like the most likely, just because the things we would have to do to avoid it seem the most unlikely.
For my sake and yours, I hope Dan ends up being wrong. And I'm sure he does too. The world we live in is filled with technologies our forefathers couldn't even conceive of, let alone contemplate the issues they would bestow upon humanity's blissful ignorance. These technologies give us leisure of the gods, but bring with it problems from the heavens. From the acidification of the ocean to the cultural, widespread depression of young people en masse due to things like social media, we have many problems headed our way, ones we live through each and every day. Hopefully enthusiastic and curious people like you will give the world your helping hand in contributing to the well-being of all people, past, present and future. From any place, anywhere, anytime, people deserve a chance at a good life, but there will be no lives to be lived if our planet dies first. The world needs you. Don't waste it. Hey guys, we hope you learned something today. Lex and Dan are two of the deepest thinkers of our time, and both deserve your support. Go check out the original podcast on Lex's channel, and be sure to watch some hardcore history too. We put links to both in the description. Thanks for hanging out, and I hope to see you next time. Stay curious.